Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for coming. My name is Duncan Calloway. I'm an associate professor of Energy and Resources Group here at UC Berkeley. Also an affiliate of EECS, and I work up at Lawrence Berkeley Lab on a lot of issues related to the kinds of things you'll be hearing Ryan talk about today. I should also welcome our web viewers who are online at the other UC Citrus campuses. If you have lunch, I'm told that that all the containers are compostable, so you're welcome to just put them all in the compost in the back of the room when you're done. A couple of other quick announcements before I introduce Ryan. We have 4 weeks left until the Big Ideas pre-proposal deadline, which is November 16th. If you're planning to submit a proposal, there is actually a writing and advising workshop on November 1st in B100 Bloom Hall from 5 to 8. You could also join by Skype if you're at one of the other campuses. And there will be advising sessions on how to put together your teams and write the application. And you can sign up online at bigideas.berkeley.edu for that advising. I should also mention that we have an additional lecture, the Minner Distinguished Lecture, Wednesday, November 9th. The title is Eccentric Orbits, the Iridium Story. The speaker will be John Bloom with panelists Ray Leopold, Dan Calusi, and Dorothy Robin. So please join if you can. So it's a real pleasure to have Ryan Hanley here to talk to us today. Ryan is the VP of Grid Engineering Solutions at SolarCity. Many of you may know SolarCity. I think Ryan's probably going to give a bit of an introduction to the company, but a very large integrator of solar electricity systems, particularly on residential, also some commercial rooftops. They have been a pioneer in the financing side of things. It's one of the reasons that they are, I believe, the largest residential solar integrator in the country. Is that? Yeah.
Residential and commercial.
Residential and commercial, great. So the Grid Engineering Solutions team at SolarCity is a really interesting place. It's a very interdisciplinary group. Ryan may say a little bit more about it. But they really work at the interface of economics, engineering, and electric power systems. So they're pushing the frontier on a lot of different topics. It's great to have Ryan back. He's an alum of the Haas School here. He's been at SolarCity for a few years, but before that was also at PG&E. So there's a lot of interesting experience that he brings to us today. So without further ado, I'll let Ryan speak.
Okay, great. Duncan, thank you for the introduction. And indeed, I'm excited to be back. In addition to graduating from Haas several years ago, I've been in this room quite a bit for, I think, probably several of your presentations. There's a lot of things I come to. And my request is, and maybe my request particularly of Professor Bornstein, is I never heckled or threw anything in your seats, so I'd ask for a quid pro quo there. And tough questions, but don't throw things. Yeah, so I'll start. I'll do a really quick overview of SolarCity and maybe talk about our work, and then I'm going to dive into some of the tough questions that we're really trying to work on. And the expectation for me is that I'm going to outline some challenges that we know we're only a part of the ecosystem that can solve it. Talk a little bit about what we're doing to engage there, but hopefully it, for some or maybe even many of you, it becomes something that you guys think about, because we're very much looking towards the universities and the national labs, entrepreneurs, to play a very important role, essential role to everything we're doing. And hopefully this resonates with a few of you. And indeed, I'll talk a little bit about SolarCity first, and then go and expand on what my team does a little bit, if it's of interest. I won't belabor this long, but SolarCity certainly started in the rooftop solar business. You know, we are the largest residential and commercial. In many ways, that is our previous business. And we're going through our own transformation, which is topical given all the talk about transformation in the energy industry. We are also reforming ourselves and really thinking about what is the new business that we need to become. And solar is integral to that, but solar is not the only component of that. And it really lands on providing services, a variety of energy services to wherever the grid needs it, in whatever capacity the grid needs it, from a host of assets. And we often call those assets DERs, or distributed energy resources. And you guys are probably pretty familiar with this. A common list of DERs are solar, smart inverters, storage, load control, EV chargers, things like that. And we very much view that as our core business going forward. And our task is not necessarily to be very good at any single one of those assets, but to be very good at having a platform that can aggregate all of those assets together and make them available to the grid when and where it's needed. And that gets a little bit to our vision here. And we'll slide through the marketing stuff pretty quick, but you'll notice it's not just a solar-focused vision statement. It's really about distributed energy resources and services that we want to provide. Which I'll lead into our products. Everybody knows that, or a lot of people know that we're a residential and commercial rooftop provider. We're certainly moving in our early phases into larger projects on the utility scale. I'm going to mainly focus about the bottom right, grid services, partly because this is the part of the business that I run for SolarCity. I also think it aligns with how I started this. It's really about aggregating many resources, providing it to the grid when and where it's needed. And this very much is our platform business. We should be able to be agnostic about any assets that we put in the ground anywhere. And as long as we can have the technology and the systems to pull those together, we should be able to make them available to grid operators and the utilities. And this is where I'll provide a little bit of background on my team. SolarCity very much started out as a construction company early in its day. A construction company maybe paired with the financing component that Duncan mentioned. We got really good at making systems affordable for customers. Moving forward, we are much more of an energy services company, we believe, and we have to really evolve into that. And my role at SolarCity in many ways was to start that process. So I started a team at SolarCity tasked with trying to understand the energy ecosystem, the grid, and we basically brought in a lot of folks from the utility. And a handful of folks that actually came through UC Berkeley as well. And we have a couple interdisciplinary focuses. One is I have all the power system engineers. I have our grid economist as well. And I also have our R&D and our future technology work. And so the three of those are really the axes that come together to start to really inform what can we do that's much more creative and dynamic, and in many ways desperately needed in the industry. Rooftop solar, distributed solar, we think will continue to be important, but it needs to be controllable. It needs to be harnessed to provide value where it's needed. Which starts to get into the main topic I want to explore at the beginning of this discussion is what should a 21st century grid look like? Everybody here is, if you're here, you certainly know there's a lot of transformation going on. And the answer to this question is certainly no one has the answer, including me. But we are thinking a lot about what should it be and what are the technologies, the policies, and the economics that should help make up this 21st century grid. So I'm going to explore this a little bit and start with the very obvious and slide forward. We start with a common challenge and objective is everybody in this room, or most people in this room, trying to address carbon or carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions more broadly. If that's the fundamental goal, it's important to think beyond, in our mind, just the generators out there. A lot of the work on climate change, or a part of the work on climate change, has been around replacing coal fleets and a lot of other natural gas fleets or fossil fuel fleets. But eventually, we believe there's a movement to electrifying almost every industry, and maybe not every, but long term, we could ask, is it inevitable that every single industry will become electrified if we really need to go after ridding our economy of natural gas and fossil fuels? And so easily you focus on the power gen, but obviously transport, heavy industries, and power consumption. And if you look at the grid from that perspective, you realize not only is the grid important today, but the grid becomes the backbone of not just the power industry, but now every industry, most industries. And thinking about how the grid is going to evolve is not necessarily only answering the question of how to modernize it today, but it's making it the backbone of many or most of our industries going forward. And that's where we think it's a really critical question to say, are we building the grid correctly? Are we only reinforcing it? What can we do going forward? And that brings me to an assessment of the grid today. I know that the figures here, the numbers are a little bit small. What I want to draw your attention to is the lines are going down. And those lines are something we call the utilization of the grid. And you've probably heard the analogy, if the grid was a factory or a machine, it would have a utilization factor in the 40s or 50s, which means most of the time, or a majority of the time, it's sitting idle and not actually being used. You have spare capacity. And that's one challenge to address, but a second challenge is it's not getting any better. It's dropping, and it means less energy is being carried by more and more expensive equipment. So we think that this is not an encouraging sign and really points to something we think a lot about. Is our grid design correct? Are we thinking about grid design with the right principles if these are moving in what we think is the wrong direction? So not only are there some worrying trends for us about how the grid is evolving, we think there's an imperative to do something now. And investment in the grid is increasing at a dramatic rate, 3x on some estimates. This is an estimate coming from Edison Electric Institute about how much CapEx, or capital expenditures, will go into the grid over the next 2 decades. And you can see in the 90s and the beginning of this century, there's a significant amount of investment into generation and T&D infrastructure. But if you look over the next 2 decades, that's going to increase by a factor of 3. So an incredible amount of money, an incredible amount of capital for this entire world is going into reinvesting in a backbone that we all use for our quality of life and all of our industries. And if we spend that money incorrectly, there are long consequences. Equipment in the grid lasts 30, 40, 50, sometimes 70 years if you're transformers. And we don't get many shots at doing this correctly. So we think that there's some worrying signs, or at least interesting signs, that say we maybe could do better. And there's an imperative that says we probably need to focus on this as soon as possible. So there are some tools that we believe we have at our disposal that are different this time around. And this time around, I basically just mean at this point in grid design, there's a tremendous amount of technology out there that many of you work on that allow us maybe to do things a lot differently. And this is another set of tired examples that you guys have seen. All of this disruption that's happened in other industries. These aren't new to you. But all of these, we believe, were really about having the customer at the center of their decisions. The customer making choices along their own preferences and taking more control on what they were doing and interacting with their industries. And maybe it's self-evident that my next slide is really going to say, this we believe is happening in energy and will happen in energy, maybe slowly, but certainly definitively. And this is another area that, from my vantage point at our company, we think that this is probably inevitable. Whether it's everybody, who knows, but a lot of our population will increasingly take control over their choices as the decisions become easier to make, streamlined to make, sometimes sexier to make if you're talking about Nest thermostats and Tesla batteries that look really neat in your garage or Tesla vehicles. But this wave is coming again. And so it begs the question, this is a whole new set of assets that none of the previous grid planners or operators had at their disposal. Does it change anything about how we design the grid? And naturally, you'll expect me to say, yes, we think it does. So I can walk through the progression of how this industry evolved, how we see it evolving, and then we'll talk about how it could really reinforce grid design. In many ways, it started with making these things accessible or affordable. And I'm speaking here to the broad distributed energy resource industry. The first thing were financial guys. They figured out how to finance these things, make them accessible. They didn't have to cost an average consumer $40,000, $50,000 to put in their home. That's the first step. But as has been documented extremely all across the industry, these assets largely are variable and they can't be controlled. And so the next phase that I think we're well underway in is adding the control component, starting to harness these assets. So instead of being a piece of hardware on the roof or in the ground, a utility operator or a grid operator can actually have the joystick to turn these things on, turn them off, change things like reactive power and power factor and make them do more exotic things. This is moving along on all fronts. The technology is available. SolarCity is now deploying smart inverters with the majority of its fleet and we'll have that as our standard option for all of our installations very soon. Policy is moving along. There are certification processes for smart inverters, and these are being put in the ground and then put in the hands of grid operators. And there's a lot of great results coming out of it. But it's only a stepping stone. If we've determined some of the hard work here about how does this control happen, what are the standards, who has the control, and what are the procedures, it gets really interesting in phase 3 where you say, all right, we've kind of figured out the ecosystem to some degree. Now let's get as many assets as we can under control so they can engage in this dynamic environment. And this is where folks like us, and once again, probably many of you, are working on individual pieces of hardware. New launches of Tesla batteries, new launches of thermostats, hot water heaters on the far right. And this should, and indeed we think will continue to really any asset in the home or business or on the grid at large should be able to receive some sort of signal. So all this, in many ways, this is my setup. These are assets that are newly available. This is a problem statement I've offered to you. And the question still remains, what needs to change about the grid? And I'll show a really quick video, pretty high level, and I hope you'll excuse some of the marketing component. But it starts to give a little bit of an intro of what we think the vision of the grid could look like.
The way they use energy changes, and today's grid isn't flexible enough to meet these new and ever-changing needs. Costly upgrades become necessary to avoid outages, keep up with growth, and manage aging infrastructures. There's a better way to deliver energy, and it starts with the customer. This is a smart energy building. It's powered by solar and connected with intelligent devices that always communicate with each other. The system creates and stores energy throughout the day. Any extra energy flows back onto the grid to power neighbors and businesses. Those smart energy buildings then power entire communities. This is the grid of tomorrow.
So not rocket science, and I probably haven't told you anything yet that you still don't know for yourself. A little bit of backup and maybe expected. But now we'll get into, if that's the setup, what's SolarCity's hypothesis? What can we do about it? And our hypothesis, very simply, is that a distributed grid, or at a minimum, a more diverse and decentralized grid can be more cost-effective, can be more resilient, and can be cleaner, enabling all these other future clean industries to prosper in the future. I'm going to walk through 3 points where a lot of our current analysis is really trying to prove. And I would indeed characterize this as a hypothesis. Our intuition tells us that this is probably true. You look at things like the financial industry, where you look at portfolio diversification, and you have assets all across. If you're building a portfolio of financial assets, you want a very diverse set of assets. If you look at the grid, we don't think it's very diverse. It has a pretty hardened central system with not a lot of interactive assets in the distributed part of the grid. And that intuition has us going down this path saying, how do we prove it? How do we know that some of these decisions to make a grid more balanced, more distributed, or decentralized is actually good and actually holds muster with the power system engineers who need to say it's possible, with the economists that need to say it saves money, it's better for society, and with policymakers that say it's possible and worth the effort. And so I'm going to start with the utilization piece and walk you through an example. So historically, grid planners, when they think about investing in the grid for, say, load growth, they have some very large assets at their disposal. Think either large substations or transmission lines. And they put those assets in the ground, and they sit there for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And the way that they think about this planning is they have some sort of forecast of load or demand that's going to happen over time. A lot of variability in what this actually could be, which we'll return to. In the past, it's been increasing in most places, say, save California. And at some point when your capacity, which we show in this very dark line, gets too close to this demand, then it's time for an investment. So you upgrade your substation, you upgrade your transformers, you add a transmission line. And you get this bump in capacity, and then it sits there for 30, 40, 50 years again until you start to get close and you need some more capacity, and then you invest again. Very reliable. In a world that values reliability, this works. And it's hard to argue with what works. Except reliability is not our only objective function anymore. We're really starting to think about cost and flexibility. And we think a world where you could start investing in smaller assets in a more targeted fashion has economic value for society. And to run through the same example, if you have the same forecast, the same demand increasing over time, this green line represents investments in infrastructure that are more targeted in nature, smaller assets, maybe a neighborhood that has distributed solar or distributed storage in their garage, and they can start to control that. You can invest a little bit and then wait and see. And if 2 years later you need some more, you can invest a little bit more. And the key of this is that you're getting rid of the underutilized capacity in the grid. And if you take this to numbers, I know this is too small to read and too much to digest right now, but the way that we've typically thought about investments from a financial perspective is you look at the dollar per capacity. And so if you're putting in a 20 MVA transformer in a substation, you'll take the cost of that substation transformer, divide it by the 20 MVA, and you get $1 per MVA or $1 per capacity. And you go with whatever is cheapest. What it doesn't consider, though, is a lot of that capacity is not used for long periods of time. And so you can imagine a world where substations are really cheap, transformers are cheap. Option one, we show our substation option. And if you look at it from a $1 per nameplate capacity, it's often cheaper than more exotic things, more newer technologies like distributed storage. But if you look at $1 per utilized capacity, it starts to shake out a little bit different, we find. And because you can start to run the system much more efficiently, $1 per the amount of capacity that you use here can often be cheaper than the amount of capacity that's here, because all of this is wasted. And so this is a simple case study that we are running on some of our models. When we extrapolate it out, there is another thing coming into play, which is you don't really ever know what load is going to do or demand is going to do. And so when you have a forecast, and here, let's say this blue line is the demand forecast that a grid planner would think about. The goal is to, let's say, put a bunch of capacity. Traditional capacity we show here in gray, and then this more targeted capacity is here in green. There's a lot of scenarios where this is cheaper if you measure it in the way that I described here. It's a lot cheaper if your forecast is wrong, or can be a lot cheaper. If you think about the recession in 2007, a lot of the demand forecast across the country looked like this, growing demand. What really happened is in 2007, it tanked and went flat for 10 years, and it still hasn't recovered significantly. If we invested this amount of capacity in our substations and our transmission lines, that's a tremendous more amount of overcapacity. What we could have done is taken an option value or wait and see. And if the load wasn't picking up, we could have pulled back on those investments. And that's capital and money that society keeps in its hand. So when you think about this example, you save a lot of money. That being said, there are examples where you lose money. And if the opposite happens, if you think you're going to get this nice growing demand forecast, but something happens and the economy really takes off and it jumps a lot, catching up with these small, let's say more expensive storage deployments, that's one we think about a lot, could be more expensive and society could lose money here. So the question is not necessarily which one of these will happen, but what's the distribution of these? And if you think about expected value and what's likely to happen, how much can society save at large? And so we've run through these examples. This is basically what I just voiced over. Sometimes the targeted solution is cheaper. Sometimes it's more expensive. And answering that question of, well, how do you find the distribution for society? And on a whole, is it more expensive or cheaper? We are starting to mine some of the data that looks at how accurate are our forecasts in the past. In other words, how accurate are these blue lines of demand? And luckily, there's great data for this. So one piece of unsolicited guidance or advice, there's a tremendous amount of data out there on places like EIA and other repositories that everyone on my team has alerts on their email, and as soon as new data gets published, we go crunch it. It's something that doesn't cost a lot of money that all of you could do from your computers as well, and that's what we've done here. We've pulled a tremendous amount of forecast data out of EIA, the Department of Energy's, one of their repositories for data, and we look at how accurate our demand forecast over time, and given how far they're looking in the future. And you can see, and you might expect this, if you're forecasting demand a year out, you're getting pretty accurate, 2, 3, 4%. But if you're starting to think about 10 years out and making these forecasts, you're less accurate. And this is, unfortunately, where a lot of the grid planning happens these days, because you think about how long it takes to site projects. It could take 10, 15, 20 years to site things like big generators or transmission lines, slightly less for smaller assets, but substations can still take 5 to 10 years to site. In those 5 years that you're working on it, the demand could have changed. You may not have needed it at all. And so we think that there's in this area of uncertainty, there's value into doing targeted, distributed deployments. So that's my first topic on, actually, I think I covered my first two here. What did I say? Increased grid utilization, just about the ability for distributed assets to take away that or that underutilization of capacity. And then we talked about these forecast errors, how planning with these smaller assets can help you avoid those. And essentially, it's the equivalent of a financial option. You can wait 3 years to make a decision. And we know from looking at the financial markets, there is an economic value to that. So the last piece I'm going to cover is contingency planning, sometimes talked about in words like resiliency and reliability. This is another area where I would definitely characterize this as a hypothesis, and you can see we call this an illustrative histogram. So don't be fooled. I'm trying to fool you that this is real data, and it's not. But it's what we think our intuition would show as we're trying to collect this data. And we show two sets of data here, one for DERs and one for generators. And this is our view of what we think a distribution of uptime would be, or how often these assets fail. And if you think about distributed resource portfolios, and by portfolios, I may say take the Bay Area. There could be 50,000 homes that have solar and storage and electric vehicles. When you aggregate those in a portfolio, that's the portfolio that I'm thinking about. And uptime of that system as a whole is very rarely ever zero. If internet goes down or communications go down or some assets fail, because they're distributed and they're not linked, it's unlikely that all of them will go out at the same time. And so, sure, those assets probably are very rarely always at 100% operating, because 1, 2, 5% of those are going to be down for some reason. But most of the time, they live in this area, 70, 90% of uptime. And that's fine, because if one of those fails, it doesn't have a detrimental impact really to the grid. Reliability and resiliency planners in the grid today talk about things like contingency planning, where they say they plan to either N-1 or N-2 or N-1-1. What that means is if you have a system that you're trying to manage, you want to plan for the worst case scenario when your biggest asset fails and you need to make sure that the grid is still working. And so in PG&E territory, they have plans that says when Diablo Canyon goes out, can the rest of the system manage all of that load that's going to pour onto the system? That's one of their N-1s. And that becomes really important when you have a Diablo Canyon down here or a big generator and it fails, because you have to have a backup system. Sometimes it's a backup transmission line. Sometimes it's a backup peaker plant that's ready to turn on and cover all of that demand. And if a big Diablo falls, that's a big peaker that you need behind it, and that costs money. Conversely, with smaller distributed assets, your N-1 scenario is, maybe the battery in my home fails. No one needs to plan for that. And that's maybe not a realistic scenario, but there are some other batteries on circuits, call them 10, 15, 20 megawatt batteries. Some of the ones that Southern California Edison are putting in now are on the order of 40 and 100 megawatts. Those are still much smaller than the traditional scale on the grid. So I characterize this and offer this to you more as intuition that we're trying to prove, and we're going through the numbers, and I think that's the task. We think it's real, but it's not real until you really can document it, and folks like you can really poke holes at it. But that's one area that we're really going after as well. So one key theme here is, so if those are some of the problem statements we're thinking about, a next challenge we think about a lot is we don't have the tools to be able to evaluate these hypotheses very well. It's very hard to be able to model a grid at large and say, what happens if you change the way that you design the grid and take out a bunch of generators and put in flexible assets in people's homes? The tools simply don't exist. And this leads to a problem statement that we're thinking a lot about, and this is part of a presentation that I gave to RPE last week, advocating for the same type of tools for all of us to use. And this is what I meant at the beginning when I said SolarCity by no means can solve this ourselves, and we need to be part of an ecosystem that includes folks like you in building these tools so smart people can ask questions and evaluate those questions. And my first challenge here is that in the last 5-10 years, there's been a tremendous amount of work evaluating DER integration, or renewable integration. Another way to say that, in my mind, is DER accommodation. We think about it a little bit negatively, and it's how do we take the existing grid and bolt on assets so they don't disrupt? And maybe in their most opportunistic or most positive light, they're starting to use those assets for value. But rare is it that a lot of studies are saying, can we really rethink the way the grid is fundamentally designed and think about alternatives from a centralized backbone going down and having something more resilient, more distributed? If people are thinking about it, they can't answer their own questions because tools to answer these questions don't exist, which leads to our objective here. We're really advocating and working with a lot of partners to try to create a model, what we call a holistic grid simulation ecosystem, which is a terrible, we have to make it more pithy. But picture all the tools that you guys are using to model your hypotheses. We can't quite do that now looking at the customer to the distribution to the substation, transmission, and generator. And therefore, we think we can't answer some of the biggest questions. So we're not starting from scratch. There's a tremendous amount of work going into this area. RPE and DOE fund a lot of this. A lot of this work goes on at UC Berkeley and other institutes and national labs. NREL has done a tremendous amount of work doing timescale analyses at the wholesale level, but these are big generators and don't quite get into homes and distribution. Conversely, NRECA and some folks at Pacific Northwest National Lab have been building distribution-focused tools, but these tools quite don't interact with the transmission tools and the market tools. And then maybe the most audacious one to date, but still not quite as far as we will argue for, is there is a lot of work that has started at IIT in Madrid, the University of Madrid, and they're building something called a reference network model that basically starts to create automatically the most efficient distribution grid according to some simplified parameters. And so NREL and MIT are working with the Madrid University to make that applicable for the United States. So all of these start to become interesting tools, but they aren't quite holistic. And you can usually bucket them into starting at the bulk level or the wholesale level, looking down. Traditionally, that's what a lot of work has happened. Or you're starting to model very finely things like homes and individual residences and individual assets and aggregating that up. We think there's, maybe not surprising, a sweet spot here in the middle where all of those can come together. And things like customer loads can influence transmission design, and transmission constraints can influence signals that customers get. I'm going to skip through the details of those three and say that we are not starting, once again, from a blank slate. There are a tremendous amount of tools that we've captured, and this is probably only some portion of the tools that are out there. What we really need is these to come in together into an ecosystem where these tools can talk to each other. And sometimes it's not sexy work. It's formatting and protocols and how these things interact. But in their absence, we believe that folks like you are not able to ask and then answer some of your most probing questions about grid design. And maybe this is a discussion that you can ping me at some future date and talk about, this is the design that we think is emerging and could be a really useful one. Building on a lot of tools, for what it's worth. This is sort of that NREL and MIT and IAT model at the center, adding transmission, adding some distribution tools. Suffice it to say before no need to dive into it, but this starts to get a simulated grid that you really can ask some probing questions. And here's some of the questions we want to ask. You've heard me talk about the first one a lot, system utilization. The second one is also probably one you've thought about a lot, integration of high levels of renewables. And then you also get into how do customers respond. Can resiliency really even be increased, like I argued my intuition was earlier, or is it much more challenging than we think? Our goal really is, as part of these ecosystems, to get a lot more smart engineers and economists and technologists thinking about these. And then my last pitch, and maybe a call for support and then an offer of support, is one fundamental challenge with the energy industry is the way it's set up and the way it's regulated. There's asymmetric access to data. Even if these models exist, a lot of us wouldn't be able to get the data to even populate it because it sits in regulated entities like utilities or like ISOs or different bodies. We are always working to try to get more access to that data. And I might call out here in California, folks at academic institutes have, the regulator here in California actually made a provision that allows folks associated with an academic institution to get access to anonymized customer data in California. If it's something that you didn't know about, I might encourage you to think about it because you're allowed to make a request. It has to be evaluated, and it could be a very rich set of data for your own analyses. We're trying to get similar rules that allow not only customer data, but the underlying grid infrastructure data available to folks like you as well. So that's my discussion on what the grid could look like. I have a really quick summary of more tactical things that my group in SolarCity are thinking about that I would characterize more as day-to-day, near-term that we're trying to solve. And I'll frame these really quickly and then open up for questions here with about 10 minutes left. We won't dive in much here. But one of the things that's changing for our business is that we no longer can be confident. We no longer have rates across the country that are fixed at every hour of the day. In some places like Hawaii, our rooftop solar systems are actually not even allowed to export power to the grid. Or in California, there are things called mandatory time of use rates, which means the rate that you get paid for energy is changing across the time of the day. And these make the challenge of putting systems on customers' roofs and in their garages a lot harder. In the past, it didn't matter what a customer's load was. You had solar on the roof, and whenever it generated energy, you were getting paid that amount of energy. It made it very simple. You put basically the most amount of solar you could put on the roof to offset that customer's usage. Now, load matters a lot. And if you take this Hawaii example, Hawaii now says you can't export to the grid and get paid. And so if this is our solar profile, kind of a normal curve of production, this underlying load matters a lot. Because if this load is pretty high and what we call coincident with solar, we can deliver a lot of that solar to the customer and deliver a lot of value. However, if this customer is maybe like some of us, they're either working or they're going to school, and they're not home in the middle of the day, their load could look like this, and then maybe peak in the evening. That customer is dramatically less profitable for companies like us, and we also save them less money if we put solar on their roofs. And the principles are easy, but what is challenging is that we never know exactly which customer is which. When you call us, we have no idea. And so there's a lot of work on, I would suggest, data analytics, machine learning, to try to forecast what type of customer you are. As soon as we get that, that's only one piece of the question. The next is, what are you going to do over 20 years? How is your load going to change and vary over 20 years? And you start to get into some really interesting questions about demographics, customer behavior, and really interesting analytic questions. So this is one of the key ones we're trying to solve as this becomes more and more of our business, where rates start to change during the course of the day. And related to that, I mentioned this earlier, but we do have something to rely on. We're not selling just solar anymore, and there are more assets. If you go back to that evening problem before, we have a couple things we can do now. You can add a battery that soaks up the solar in the day and then spits it out in the evening. You can lower your thermostat or increase it in pre-cool, and you also can dump solar power into thermal storage, like hot water heaters or ice storage for air conditioners. These assets are only going to increase and get better, and so really the intelligence around how you size that, how you deploy it, is a separate reinforcing science and part of our business. And then the next one is around, you may have heard multi-use optimization. As assets become, I'll take kind of the most common asset, a battery. Batteries have a lot of hype, and batteries are very flexible, increasingly flexible, and to an operator, they're almost a dream device in many ways because you can make them do whatever you want them to do. And you compare that to generators that are in the ground today. If you turn a generator on, it may take 60, 120 minutes to even ramp up. Batteries turn on almost instantaneously, so they're really exciting. But the challenge is they're also expensive. And you also have that utilization problem. They sit idle for a lot of the time today because they don't have access to a lot of different revenue streams. And so on the policy side, we work a lot to try to open up revenue streams. In other words, ways to get paid by these batteries. The easiest one is to shift solar power, say, for a customer to help them with their time of use rates. But then you get into more exotic things like discharge when the utility wants it to discharge to reduce a strain that they may have in the summer. Or even more exotically, take it to the wholesale market and add things like frequency regulation and ramping reserve, things like that. In order to do those well, the secret really is to utilizing that asset as much as you can to get all the revenue you can. And so you start to get into some really interesting multivariate optimization analyses. That is a data and a data science problem that we think a lot about. And I'm sure many of you in the room do as well. With that, I appreciate the time. You let me talk about quite a few things, so if there are questions, I welcome them.
Yeah, let's go ahead and thank Ryan. So I have a microphone here. Go ahead and raise your hand, and I can bring it over, and folks can ask questions. We have about 10 minutes for that. Oh, great.
So how many questions I can ask? Okay, the first one, I think in the very beginning, you mentioned that you pretty much deployed all the smart inverter as a standard package now. What's the percentage you put the smart inverter on your PV, and how much interaction you have with utility operation if you use a smart inverter? Did you actually turn on the function in the smart inverter?
Yeah, historically it changes by state, but I would say roughly 10% of our current installs have the smart inverter functionalities. All of California inverters will have to be smart 12 months, about 10 months from now. There was a trigger that as soon as a certification from IEEE and from Underwriters Laboratory became available, every inverter needs to be smart. So it's still a small percentage, but as far as testing the functionality, we've tested the full suite of functionalities. We deployed about 400 kilowatts of smart inverters in San Diego gas and electric territory earlier this year, and we wrapped up our pilot with them recently where we gave them control of the full suite of inverters, and they ran through all the, I call it the reactive power use cases, kind of the common ones there. And that was the first pilot of its kind here in the United States, and increasingly there's more of those. We have an active one with PG&E right now where we're doing something similar. What's different is they're actually integrating our control system into their control system and doing it without an engineer in the loop. So automated all this control. So increasingly, it's really picking up. And even though 10% for the industry sounds like a really small number, if you think about the growth rate of solar that's likely to come on the grid in the next few years, it doesn't take very long till you have a majority of assets out there, of solar assets out there that have smart inverters and are controllable. So we're really planning for that world.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you for your time. I'm Mariana, a grad student here in Berkeley, and I was wondering, where do you see the future of natural gas going?
Good question. So if I wear my SolarCity green, if I have my green blood running through my body of SolarCity, we say it needs to go away. I don't believe that. Natural gas, So this is a personal answer. This is not a company answer, but I think we need a little bit of everything and probably a lot of everything. And even though I'm using words like inevitable in these slides, that doesn't mean inevitable tomorrow or in the next decade. And so we're realistic, and those assets provide a lot of reliability, resiliency, and heck, if they can replace the coal plants as a starter, as an individual, I'm pretty excited about that. And then there's the next question of how do you go even further and strive for a 100% renewable world. I won't pretend to know timing on that, but we're not against thinking about that as part of our portfolio in the near term.
So I had a quick question about it's a compelling vision with the grid design, sort of, especially this idea about incremental capacity addition, sort of getting rid of those chunks. If you talk to a distribution planning engineer, their biggest priority is sort of managing risk and making sure that there aren't outages on their watch, or whether it's a 10-year planning timescale or a short one. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on sort of, does there need to be a change in the culture or the perception of a distribution planning engineer in terms of letting them rely more on assets behind the customer meter for making sure that they're still doing their job as stewards of reliability?
Absolutely. There's a handful of challenges there. One, the first is technical, of can we even do what I'm suggesting is real here? And there's work to be done on showing these portfolios are resilient and reliable enough to replace a lot of infrastructure. And there is a good amount of pilots that are really diving into this and testing it. And I don't think that we're there yet technically, but it's coming quick. And the second speaks to the culture of who makes these decisions. And utilities across the country, we know, if you guys are in the Bay Area, you know PG&E, they're a very big and innovative company. There are 3,000 co-op utilities across the country that some of them don't have as many people in their company as we have in this room. And expecting engineers that are making decisions about reliability to read the latest national lab report that's not going to happen. And so part of what we think we really are shooting for here is not necessarily definitive studies. Let me say, to say it a different way, these studies can start to build intuition, a collective intuition about within all of the folks that are making these decisions deep down in organizations. It'll take time. There's culture change involved. There's a lot of leadership involved. A lot of utilities aren't going to want to make this move themselves. So in the past and the recent history, we've relied on very innovative regulators who are setting aggressive visions. But it's one of the more daunting things I think about, both on the technical side, Duncan, as well as the culture change. Even if technically we can prove it, there's a whole another decade or two of really disseminating these new best practices if they exist.
I think, time for one more question, Jonathan.
Hi there. So two scenarios. So one is that every house in the US has its own solar panel and a battery. The other is that
I'll take that one.
Sorry?
I'll take that one.
Right? Okay. The other one is ultimate centralization. There's one massive solar plant and one massive battery, and every house is connected to it via a transmission line. So we have these trade-offs of economies of scale, kind of losses for transmission, and also, as you say, these kind of resiliency or failure bottlenecks. So where does that sweet spot lie in terms of centralization, decentralization, and kind of does everybody need their own solar panel and battery? Could it be a community, or I don't know, what level does that happen? And certainly, does SolarCity see itself as an eventual aggregator of these assets as well?
I think that those are, on purpose, those were false choices, and I don't think either scenario is likely or best or cost effective. No, not every single home needs necessarily a solar panel and batteries. The answer is certainly somewhere in the middle, and I don't know exactly where it lies, but we have a lot of confidence that it's not where it currently lies. Today's grid is much more of your second scenario, very centralized, reinforced, and it doesn't have to swing all the way to every single asset is distributed, but it needs to swing some distance, we believe, to reflect what we think we know are principles that, once again, we borrow from the financial industry. Diversification is really a key principle here that we're chasing.
Okay, let's go ahead and thank Ryan. That was really very enjoyable.
Yeah, thanks.